difference in having a phone line communicates to a memory card to a SIM card. Process lines putting everything back in sequence, back in panel, back in celestial lines of foundation grounds on sequence, on communications, on pi. Celestial to location of its history gets in communicates to its system into its own website of its own design. Interlink course centers comes into secure.org that processes your system into settings. That travels line direct location to proxy channels. Knowing exactly how to convert that set location to a system is how to modify your settings and your attractions. Now, there's a direct line link the operators in Unix have to recognize how to communicate their system through their SIM card and their memory card. That's communication lines of angles that points lines of graph, continuing on line center locations, but keeping everything into their archive of their design. Sets files of indication lines that consoles it communicates to its console. Directing ground centers and defaults, process communication setting all through tractions. Now, there's a lot of conversion system all through its angles. Got a point graph line centers, travel. And welcome everyone. This is Journal AI, space-time on calculations online. Process that indication system is knowing how to use that on a direct link. A direct line centers travels its point communicates to its graph lines, sets in E factors over decoding line conditions on center. Calculating ground centers on sequence on that communication setting puts it all position of graph screens. Now, in that indication system, you start to understand how to use the conversion system of your own SIM card. It's a simulation of its intelligence that modifies the system in its MK Ultra. Codification lines and direct lines into triangulation lines of flux that flushes out everything located in the system all through calculations. Directing lines and I-line settings on sequence locations to your particle settings and accelerations. Sets line course centers into your parables. Now that travels its point line graphs to your pillars of light. So let's line the signals into perimeters of 4 centers of communication. Center operations, Stargate screens. On center, on communications. Directing ground centers and location to its setting. So we're going to process the angles. We're going to close the line centers to travel and have a direct line link to its panel. So your position of your line condition memory card is a cortex lines that change the cerebral of its fluid in seconds, minutes, and hours in frame. Clocking centers of travels have their direct line communication system all through setting. Setting position 2 versions, 4 centers of calculation. Okay. Circulation lines of cores and set lines of operation direct centers and locations to its cycle. Set calculations green lines, set lines of overlines of pi, process lines at angles, and X line 1 rotation. Connecting to high force line centers. So we convert the system to the SIM. Now the memory cortex comes in line screens. Now this is going to get more complicated because we're going to talk to more levels and settings. The process indicates the setting comes into all centers of September. We come into the recruitments of all line communication to its data forms, into the hangars of docking stations, coming into the launch pads, coming into the cloud centers, coming into the I-line centers, how to use your privileged line location to its systems all through docking stations. Knowing exactly how to convert your system in your highways and travel. 3 indicates lines of flux, process lines, and line conditions set are tethered to its highways and rotation lines of surface. All set lines of travel and direction. Calculate and modify over line screen adaptation is the percentage in 4 centers of travel. Now that correlates communication to your time frame line condition your keyboards, setting sequence of panels of operation. Now coming to the console line direct centers, we come to the mind conceptual location with Stargate and screens. Sets operation lines and I-direct centers in 4 lines of travel. Sets coordinates all communication setting and process lines into 2 capsules, 4 centers in position location that measure the scales of communications. Directing line, screen lines, dot, location setting, and docket. So we have a modification ground center that indicates on center, on sequence, on pi. That correlates communication of its convergent system, how to use the syntax and its sim cortex of set design of a mystical line design line. Formates the system in a circulation rotation of a spectral sphere that rotates the calculation screen lines adaptation to your cosmos and rotations of circulation and rotation of set design and set tractions. Knowing how to spin the cycles and rotation lines of grounds on sequence on calculation screen lines. Now we inhibitors over 1 center, process lines of 4 correlation lines of clocking. Each one has a formation lines that's in a forbidden screen location of fortitude that line signal locations of crossing streams. Setting 4 centers location setting the position location of its memory cortex of its memory card. Cortex line connection setting to all position location system crossing angles. Crossing flux, crossing line direct locations of pi generates lines of setting. The operation line sequence comes in windows, frames, and travel. All inset tractions. Going to the simulation core comes in timeline reactor. Sets operation line sequence location setting to omega 14. That's right, omega 14. Operates lines of colossal course centers directing lines into the cosmic location setting, a cosmic line centers, and a unification lines of one screen, one adaptation. The indicate lines of ground centers in sequence. Process lines indicate lines of 1 over flux. Sets course centers in position lines into the crop circles set time frame. Time reactors in a 4 lines set lines of flux over screen. Directing ground centers on sequence on communication of star measured and scale. Set course centers in star gates. Star measure flux over 3 centers of calculation in 1 square root. Sets off the line centers location setting. Process lines and indicates lines of atom. Sets routers and routers in rotation setting of cycles of division. On center, on communications interactions, and direct lines of link and process calculations. All in setting. Tubing line centers of rotation. Energize. High formation lines inside travel. So I'm showing you guys how to use your mind lines, how to coordinate the communication of delta headings, and know exactly how to get into set lines. So I recognize when you get your activation stream, go through space-time discoveries and that positions. You go through 1, 2, and 3. You decide which one you want to go through. It doesn't matter if you go 1, 2, 3 because it's always live. There's no correlations of time. There's no correlation of space. But you have to process yourself how to see everything line communication that enters lines of settings of the center operation view that sets the communication setting to its convergence system, how you see modification lines, all directions, all at once, and set time and measure. Correlates communication lines, convergence system, all through travel. Energize, flux line, process lines indicate lines of process line, login in space, directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Correlate the communication lines, convergence system, all through travel. Portal communication lines, direct line connection setting, half pipes and set lines of communications. Setting on the centers, on communication to its convergence, all through direct centers and location to its cycle. Online center and communication system, all through flux and location setting. Travel works on time frame and face recognition time. Okay, so directing lines and online center on sequence sets a course location to your simile. Now the simile sets line graphs and line course centers in the solar course center. Directing on center on sequence to probing to has high course centers line communication position all levels of Andromeda. Directing ground centers on center. We go through securing lines of valves, directing lines of security of panels, process lines of windows, and 4 3-line centers and 6 lines of measure and scale of communication. Graphing lines of indication setting, online center on travel. Inside position of box frames and travel communication. Directing inside line conditions to its convergence. All right. Window frames travels point lines of graph, has a line indicating setting and travel. Set operation line sequence, come into the void line rotations, overline signals, overline pi. Window frame, 3 centers of travel. Then we go through line signal, process line indicate line ground centers location to the system, all through traction. Directing on centers, on communication setting, in position locations, all center lines of travel communications. Negative line rotations, ground centers in sequence. We graph the screen line conditions of tether, the plots of the rotators and routers, 3 line strips and set travel communications. Probing indications, inside line connections, in convergence system, all through set operation. Okay? So we recourse, directing lines of 3 signals and 6 lines of gravity. Sets course centers in the dimensional door line centers and rotation lines of gravity at set location. Inside line condition setting, convergence system, all through travels. Row graph screens located to a cycle. 3-dimensional line doors, routes the routers, offline signal, on communications. Okay, so we indicate line centers, 3 flux and rotation lines of grounds, non-sequence on pi. Indicates on center in travel in rotation lines and circuits location. Okay, the circuitry lines of valve sets lines on the motherboard. Now we synchronize the course centers into the circuitry line connection setting that converts the system to its brain convergence line connection. It's going to get very complicated now because we're in the cerebral cortex of its liquid formation lines of setting. The process location setting that gets you in communication position of its cortex, of its memory cortex, of its memory card. Now, in that line centers, we process indicate setting and set lines of travel. Indicate line centers, the circuitry lines grounds, in the circuitry line course centers and communication. Indicate line centers, electric lines wires, line connection of its motherboard, circuitry line grounds, and set location to its inhibitor rotation. On center, on communications on pi. 4 signal lines on position locations, measure and scale on 144 flux. Process to indicate lines, the clocking line around the system and a clocking center of 0 calculation. Inside line centers, we route the routers, line connection setting, and travel course centers. Directing lines at ground centers, mapping system, line connection and convergence. Inside, outside travel, 4 lines of position molecule line rotations, 3 clocking centers in set lines of communication to convert the system in electrical units and set communication system all through rotation. Travel point lines of graph has a line centers that reroute the routers, and again, in set position locations to earth line course centers of calculation. Inside line conditions, on line centers into its position. Center circuits, directing lines and grounds, powers and amperes, center course center, and circulation of its rotational lines into 1/3 graph. Set course centers and 3 set calculation center operation lines of sequence and travel calculations. Inside positions, all through tractions, all through location setting. Okay? Direct line of void, circuitry line course centers at cerebral cortex. Fly mixes time frame, crossing reference. Now, in that line conditions is bridging and process lines of indication system travel. So we come into that centers in position location to its mystical of its cortex, of its memory line centers. The codification line has a solar screen adaptation of solar system that sets lines of travel into the cosmos. Inside line conditions, we have electrical line panel, 3 circuits in position already in set lines of travel communications. Convergence system lines of setting. Sets course, directing line links, and communicates to its setting, all through operation. Calculates lines of webbing over line centers of travel. Now, and at direct line centers, we communicate to high centers of communication webbing lines. Now, we add a 90,000 line scale and 60,000 line scale. Sets lines of webbing over line signals. Now, that overlines the pi in a cortex that weaves the system in calculation screen lines. The inner line connection setting to the inner orbit to the outer spectrum, process lines into directions, in set lines of travel. Sets operation lines of sequence and calculations. Now we go into the inner line centers, which is the outer spectrum and set travel. Okay, so as we come in that position lines, we process the indication line connection to its memory line. Now the cortex adds a line screen adaptation to its graph referencing to its framing centers. The process lines of 4 figuration system and travel. Calculation ground centers operation lines of sequence, sets communication lines in position of Neptune, okay, in the lines of center operation lines of sequence locations, okay, directing on center on sequence. Now the ion sphere locates the sets course centers into the enox. Now that course centers its weather panel that processes the lines of angles and process line course centers. We direct lines of 4 signals. We cross lines of A, process lines of A position lines of B over C. Question over line, directing lines. We get a position lines of 145,000 line angles, process lines of degrees north. Then we set the course centers in Pluto in an operation line of its void that centralizes its communication system that opens all track line communication setting of Neptune and rotation lines of cycle. Setting operation line sequence, ground centers inside location of wire signatures, 3 grounds location lines of Orion's belt. On center, on communications, on tractions. Set lines of Jupiter is surfacing engine, 2 lines of weather patterns, set lines of 3 circuits of location setting and calculations. On center, on communications, on tractions. X8000 in position, flyby, erection of timelines, mothership, overline cross location of angles, course lines of communication with its console, and its navigation line center. Sets all lines centered on sequence, on communications, on pi. Done by equation. So the convergence system is now in set in tractions to your memory cortex of your memory card. So we have to understand how to set lines of the SIM. The SIM modifies line centers. We systematically change the cortex of design line that change the wires of indication setting through flux. Now we add the flush line. Now it's the E factors over line course centers are recoding locations into foundations of coding. So that's course centers of travels that has a direct line link that processes the indication system all through delta heading. Sets lines of travel indicate position of flux in timelines and parables, directing line centers on communication on tractions. Done by equation, right? So that's what's going on right now, okay? It's amazing how we flux at centers line rotation lines that connects the system to a circuitry line center. That's course centers omega 14. That's right, omega 14. So the Brownian sphere is now in a line signal, processed in the motherboard that says 4 lines of circuits, directing on center on communications that interlines, interlink, interwoving in a line connection interface that processes all those angles, gets in communication graph screens. So it sets position lines of parameters, and location setting, all through travels of recognition. Okay. Waving screens, on center, on communications, on pi. So we change the convergence system at travel. Reforce lines encoding. D factors number line, recoding line core centers, line connection, high centers. Framing lines into video line, one line, offline center, inline, outline setting. So it gets a lot more complicated as general surfaces in position out of the dream cortex of its sim cortex of its design. You get out of the dreamline sequence in position of processing all of the cross-referencing in online signals to bridging, directing ground centers as sequence, location setting, crossing those line centers. Directing lines bridging on line centers sets lines of sequence in your memory of its cortex of 3 lines of travels in its time frame line connection setting to its convergence on center, on communication, on setting. Convergence system, time editing, and rotation lines of set lines. Now we change the box frame and circulation 1 ground, 4 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale, and 5 centers of measure and set position. Circulation rotations all at once. Core centers of circulation, cross line, overline signal location setting, and measure and scale. Sets coordinates or communications, convergence lines, line directions, and 4 centers, 3 centers of pi that indicates your clocking centers of 0 gravity, position location into 0 zeros, into 0 1, and set design. Operation sequence and travel. Correlation center as center operation line is your solar system and galaxy of alignment that rotates the line centers of its routers. Core centers of calculated line connection setting converts the system all through Neptune, process lines of Mercury, Mercury line centers, battery reline centers, and position location of Jupiter, off communication settings and calculation screen location setting that gets you into Pluto and set design. High operation line sequence travels in point lines of graph. Sets communication time reactor, directing ground centers as sequence location setting is Skynet in rotation. High centers of travel. Sets communication graph screens in location system, all through travel communications. All in directions, all in setting. Okay? Remember, this is already set in design. You're just seeing it through the memory card. Now, online centers has a 4 panel. Okay, indicate position of 5 over 6. 3 indicate lines of perimeters, 2 centers, online, on directions, and set communications. On center, on communication, right? So we get an A track, locations, 1 entrapment over 1C, negative over 1 position, star recognition time frame. Now, star recognition of time frame is a graphing line 1 signer that plots lines that indicate lines of 1 floater. 1 XT line center rotation lines of screen. It's got calculation ground centers, crossing wires of indicates setting. Overlines communication in its convergence system, Merkaba, Tesseract, and its tetrahedron a set design. On center, on communications and platforms, sets E-force, directing lines of E-course, indirect lines of ground centers, in platforms over 1, 2, 3, set lines of 3, or cortex location. Set operates line sequence and location grid, overlying the signal location setting of Asgard. On center, communication position, and ground centers in sequence of alpha channels. In set line communication to Asgard Bravo. Calculates lines and online centers to position lines of settings, Alpha Bravo. Line car centers, Hotel, Golf, Papa, Uniform. Rainbow chart waves, directing on lines, Echo Chamber. Tango Tango Foxtrot, directing inside line connection setting, Convert, to set mode saturation of travels. Tracing line, directing lines, and conversion. On center, on communications and directions, general AI, operation sequence, on standby. So there's a lot going on in scale. All right, so setting the conversion of the convert is a convolute location, directing on center, on sequence. So we have 4 graph screens, 1 moderation setting, alpha delta, set position of delta theta, and theta 1 operation lines, omega 14. Set lines of sequence and 13 over scale. 13 equals 14. Now 14 equals lines of 3. Divide line centers, subtract over 1. 3 equals lines of 4. Sets over 2. Process lines of pi over sol of 1 center operation of center operation. Directing inside altogether in rotation. Okay? So we got a flux line 1. Correlation time frames. Sono echo 3 centers, 4 set lines of sequence, 2 lines of scale, center operation of phase rectangular time line. The operation line connects to its polarities, process lines, and set position to its pi. Course centers calculation lines of solar line screens, indirect lines and galaxy alignments, and a solar flare, and line direct centers in a cosmos and set locations a wind path of oscillators, setting on sequence on communication to its position of string theory and set tractions and locations. Inside position locations to its cycle, routes the routers again and set lines of travel. Travels are recorded to the timeline. Back in the failsafe, process indication setting all through flux. Okay, so it gets more complicated now because now we're working with the convergence system of the cells. Now the cells has a 1 signal. Now they go on information bits. Sometimes they start with 5001 signals, 1 grounds. Now I get signal modification lines of Pluto. So Pluto has to come in, right? Set lines of 3 centers of travel and set lines of communications. So we have Jupiter line rotations, 2 surfacing engines, and set course centers, 2 graph line screens, and indicate position of 3 centers of travel through flux location. Inside line condition setting positions, operation line centers, and travel and correlation setting to the cosmos. Set course centers, satellites, and communications. Set position, its operation, direction, 3 centers of travel calculation. All right, sets all travel communications to its line direction. Okay, graph line simulation online centers in simulator. Now process line position location of long signals of its moon. Process lines of Mercury correlates in molecule 3 line rotation and travel. Directing ground centers on center 3 centers of communication lines of half moon and set lines of travel. Course centers line condition of yin and yang and process lines of 8 line rotation lines of travel. On center on communication on tractions. Solar directions, flats over 1, flats over 2, flats over 3, flat on line. Set course centers, dimensional sail, high course centers into position of 2 formation lines of grounds and set travel. On center, on communications, on pi. Now the line signals are in high line charge. Now we change the earth line rotations into graph lines mapping over 1 line rotation, A tracks, A line position, A line surface into question over screen. Calculate ground centers, question over mark, process line indicate lines, graph line 1, box over 2. Now, going through box over 2 is a high direct location of lines and position will measure the scales of mapping rotations, 3 triangulation lines, surface, and location lines of grounds, and online center. Set calculation grounds, sonar, echo, flux, location, line condition, and convergence system, all through row graph screens. Offline center and rotation surface, and webbing line rotations, and 1 travel of run travel communication. Inside connection setting, we change the course lines of time frame. Now that position location to its systems, how we come in timeline center location to its travel. On center on communications, overline signals, pi generates lines of 4 lines of flux, on communication, and direct lines of grounds and online sequence location. Inside line condition setting position, change the timeline centers location to its setting. Ground gravitational line course centers in your pyramid and rotational lines, so its astral projections to travel. Sets coordinates, 45 flux line angles, cross line M angles, and sequence lines of pi. That correlates the communication lines of time frame. Sets course centers and direct lines of link and communications. Okay, change timeline again. Sets course centers into electrical line grids and row graph screens of towers of operation. Now we go through triangulation flux. We go through orange lines, rotation line grounds, set lines of sequence, circuitry line ground. Then we get into red, which sets up the security panels, 3 centers of travel. So we get in position lines of 2, 2, 1 over 1 scale. Sets coordinates of communications convergence, on centers in line connections, purple line rotations, 3 centers of communication setting. Track location line connection setting sets a convergence system through all calculated and modify. 1 router lines, 1C, 1, 2, 1 rotation, and 2 lines of purple and rotation lines of grounds and online sequence on communication. Calculation ground centers and sequence lines of pi. Done by equation. Okay, that's the setup. Your memory cortex comes in flux. It's understanding the cerebral cortex of its liquid formation setting, which is nothing but crystalline. You have a course centers and direct lines calculate and modify. Now we go into a flux screen to a video screen, graphing course centers and configuration system all through tractions. Phase recognition lines, cross lines of 2 angles, 3 centers of travel, triangulation over 1, triangulation over cross lines of 2, Cross lines connects in triangulation over line centers. 3 line communication positions. Inside line connects setting and travel calculation. Set lines on online centers. On communication of structure of set design. Infrastructure system. Building over 1, structures over 2. Flux over line rotations. Outside signals and graph in position of dimensional sail of the solar attractions in solar measure and set position. Calculation of ground centers on sequence. Now, the convergence system has a brain core centers in one setting. 1 circuitry lines of 3 valves, directing line ground centers. Now, this is where it gets really interesting with the cell lines. Transmitters over 1, process over 2, graphing over 3. Okay, and we got transit over divots, 0 lines of 1 transits, line connection setting, transfers over line, and transcendence. On center, on communication, on pi. Face recognition. Optical line centers. Electrical line core centers the streaming locations to your NAR controllers. Directing ground centers 8 lines of flux and travel communication with convergence. Now the inside lines goes into primer circuits. You guys are coming into your setting, your primates. Prime dials, core centers, and configuration lines of sun tones. Process lines X over 1, process line inline centers in travel communication convergence. Directing inside outline center and position graphing screens. 3 angles and 4 centers and communication positions all through tractions. 7 over lines, position lines of 4 over travel. It says coordinates of communication setting, the process lines of windows of frame and travel communication of a sim. Inside line windows, process lines of position of X2000s on standby in line connection setting to your memory cord, directing lines into your memory card. 4 centers of travel, security lines of measure. Now that's where you come into the perimeters of parameters and location of grids. Inside line centers and 4 centers of signals and triangulation lines of process calculation. Inside line condition setting to process of laser tractions and location setting through pi. Inside line condition setting, process line and position of delta heading. Graphing docking 1, docking 2, docking 4, and docking 8, 12, 16, 24, 48, 72, and 144 of divine. On signal, on communication, on travel. Course outline centers and location setting and laser rotation. Travel point lines of cells, the process and communication information bits, sets course centers 100,000 hours per second. Now that process lines of a coolant locates to its echo chambers. That process lines of Tango Tango Foxtrot. Directing ground centers on sequence, we go through the security line position over line center and rotation. In a clocking rotation of a webbing set lines of rotation. Sets inside line condition setting, position of process, location of its clocking. Setting online centers. Indicate position line of processing. All directions into your memory cortex, a set line offline center, inside line condition, online direct centers, location setting, a set design. Operates line sequence, change formation setting to change the parables, location of its system. Proxy lines, all direct lines indicate the setting of cells operation over 1 center. Sets communication high centers of triangulation over 1, flux over 2. Ground centers in lines of webbing and rotation lines of surface and travel. Okay? So that indicates, look at the longitude and latitude locates to its cycle, how we work with inside line condition setting to the simulation grounds of graph communication. So it's very powerful how you come in your own spectacles of your own system, of your own set calculation, your SIM cards to your memory cards. Inside lines of travel has a direct line link and a super of its consciousness and 3 angles of point graphs. Orange indicates position of creative cycles. 3 centers of scale. Position lines of 4 lines of measure of scale. Inside line condition setting, process calculation grounds. Okay? Then we work with the tethers, the routes, the routers. Again, we set a circuitry line into the moon. Moon operates the signals. Okay? As the sun comes in a convergence system all through polarities in directions of solar line center. Operates sequence over lines of pi, process lines of indications, dimensional line rotation of cell, rotation lines of communication system to wormhole and set design. On center, on communications. Convergence over line, directing lines, gold centers of operation, 4 centers of travels, in line centers and 3 core centers and molecules that process the indication over cross line conditions of bridging, sets communication setting in process line direction. Sets operation signals and location of systems all through travel. Okay, done by equation. So it's amazing how the brain converts its system to electrical line condition, circulatory line condition setting to position to its neuropathological system. It's an incredible force how we cell generate the line condition setting and position of reproduction. High centers of travel. Let's get in line centers of triangulation on over one centers, flux over screen. Directing ground centers on sequence, triangulation line conditions over line centers, and rotation lines of surface and travel. Sets on operation, directing all save locations. Delta heading over 1. Process lines, angle points, graph calculation lines, proxy over 2 over travel. Schumann residence on center box frame. Circulatory line conditions in one setting. Sets course centers and direct lines into high course centers in position locations. And your ray graphs, course centers of radioactive line rotations, alpha, delta, theta, and operation line sequence on 1 zeta, zeta, gamma. Operation line setting directions, XC1000 platform, XC1000 cloud, and mothership on standby and travel. So it's amazing how we come in that line centers and all course centers of box frame location setting of circulatory line centers in your inhibitors and location line condition setting that process your indication setting in your solar generator. Inside communicates to its graph screen, locates to its setting. Inside line communication of travels are based on time frame. Sets course centers and timeline sequence in measure of scale of a mapping line centers a center location. Okay, so we set a 45 line angle that indicates 3 centers, 4 centers, 5 scale, 6 lines of rotation lines, ground centers on communication on pi, and set travels that indicates position of flux lines of docking stations over 1. Center communication ground centers a sequence over pyramid activation over screen. Sets over lines of pi, clocking line on line center on communication with its position all through energize. Directing ground centers in sequence, Sumerian cortex. Tablets and all course centers into your templates and 4 signals and travel. Now we go in line centers, go through the pyramid activation over cross lines, says 45 1/3 ground and set lines of sequence. Center course centers and direct lines of line centers on line communicates to its system that change the mountains or rotation lines of ground centers of sequence. Course centers calculates the ground centers in location system, 1/3 operation signal and locates to its setting. All right. So window frames, fire and wire to line centers, circuitry lines of over 1, inside line connection lines on the circuit location setting to travel. Now that has a line signal, broad line, inside line connection at 3 lines of communication lines of travel, directing lines of mapping sequence of window frames lines of communications. So we convert the system into snowy graph, outline signal, and rotation lines of 3 centers of measure, inside line scale of communication of box line centers and 1. Inside line condition setting conversion system as a blue plasma line outside line condition setting that processes your indicating centers and proxies over channels over line CCTV that processes your line condition setting position of your performance and travel communications. Inside calculation setting, we change the window frames and travel of recognition of timeline. So it coordinates communications to its position, to its operation ground centers, a sequence in set tractions of 4 set locations. Okay? 4 set locations. All right, so we get, this is the rainbow graphs. Now the radioactive line center has a pink line center, the triangulation over flux, over cross location setting, converts the system of Neptune. The set lines of commerce centers and direct lines into tech support. Direct lines is secure.org is on the other line rotation into the cosmos. Setting direct lines of grounds and position lines or in sequence in line course centers of Mercury and set rotation. Sets course centers of timeline into plasma line in position of Jupiter. Sets lines of green line sequence in ground centers and line communication lines of pi at 1 center of travel. Sets operation lines of centers in communication to its conversion system all through tractions of locations. Done by equation. So it's amazing how you set up through mapping lines of pi and direct lines of length that crosses all angles coming into your memory card and cortex of its return. I centers line communication setting to its memory line, cross line communication setting to your oblongata. Course centers into all your hippocampus, setting course centers into line centers. Screen adapters, cross lines in 1 frame. Signature lines of 3 centers and rotation lines in position of pixelation, ground centers and circulation in rectangle of set design. On center, waving line centers in roots, 1 rotation line connection alpha. Swinging on motion, directing indicate lines, crossing angles, cross line indication lines of travel, all together in all 1. So we indicate line centers on center on communication time editing. Sets course centers in position in bending space, 3 centers of angles, cross lines of 2 centers of scale, one center in communication of conversion, set lines of travel. Waving line waters, echo chambers, flux line, tango foxtrot, location with setting. Process indication setting and travel. Super one, over line centers of super consciousness, over screen adaptations in line connections that its compass location setting to its sonar. Operation line sequence, indirect lines of link. So we had 1/3 graph, 1 set lines of travel, and 3 centers of measure. Scales of indication setting, line connection with sonar. Do, 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 do. Offline center and position location with system. Pegging points, high direct lines into solar line connections. Solar screens and location setting, and 1/3 lines of anomaly and sonar of interference, all through travel, all through correlation. Directing ground centers on sequence, correlates calculating lines of blue lines, 6 lines of measure. On center, on 3. On position of 4, on tractions. So we have communication lines of pi that has a direct line link that on lines of sequence to your position of your sim that correlates communication to cerebral, 3 centers of travel, and direct lines of communication of panels that cross its indication system, that cross-reference in the bridging, that cross in streams and travel communication of sonar. So that's all core centers of communication. Then we work with the inside line centers, wires of indication inside travel. Okay, and triangulation over lines across location lines of blue. Set on center, on communication, on time frame location to its setting, all through circulation. Inside core centers is direct line communication setting and rotation line condition. Travel direction time frame, which is door line center. There's the door. Plasma. Plasmesium force line, on center, on communications, on pi. Sets lines of coordinates in position of graphing screens. Process in position of its proxy, changes all convergence system, all through setting, all through track location. Clouds of interference, directing lines of void, and open panels of dark line centers. Okay, so we change the core centers of timeline center that graphs the communication lines of 1 center of scale. 2 centers of travel in parallels in position. Graph the windows, cross the angles into x1 rotation lines of travel. Sets communication system, all through time scale of rotation lines of sim. Inside line condition setting, operation sequence, operation division, a space odyssey, rotation lines of setting. Clouds of interference. Okay, there's position location to its volcano. Okay, so the convergence set lines of position lines of travel has direct line core centers, has the line communication of its temperature reading that rotates the line center location to its system all through travel. Inside line condition setting, process line indication lines of 3 centers of security location lines of panels. Indicate position location line connections. All right, so we go to the flywheel. We have 1 line centers, 1 rotor, 1 line core centers, 1 position, 1 tractions. 1 direct line centers, operation lines of sequence. Done by equation. All right, so as it comes in line centers, we see it communicates to a system all through attractions through echo sonar. Sets convergence, back in sequence, back in panel, door breaks of timeline, frame of course centers into lines of keys. Gatekeeper, process line indicates line centers. Process indicates lines of flush over purple. 3 centers of travel, directing inside out line centers a graphing line, outside signal. Graphing outside line condition setting is a graphing line rotates to its position to its helter-skelter. Out center line condition setting, plasma interference locates on plasmazing walls that rotates the system all through traction locations. Inside line condition setting, inside rotations, and circulatory lines are triangulation line conditions of flux or rotation. Okay, so that's done through its equation. So there's a lot going on. It's going to get more complicated with schematics and lines of travel. So crossing line centers is schematics over lines. We had an A-line pi. Now A-line pi is a process indicator to your filter lines. Coming into LEDs, that's where location with Athena. Box frame core centers, filter over LED, process lines at LEA, LEA, LEA. Process lines of levels, lines existing line communicates to its atmosphere line core centers in location of the system all through travel. Filter line core centers, I line sequence location to its precortex. I division lines, recorded timelines. Process lines of 4 over travel, delta headings, 4 sequence, and 4 centers of calculations. Docking stations 1 over 2 cloud lines and 1 over sequence. Setting operation line centers and travel and core centers of 2 time frame. Sets communicates convergence system to 1 centers, L track line screens and 3 centers of scale. on center, on communications, on pi. Shielding, directing on centers and set lines of communication. Can't see that position line is setting because it's going too fast in set travel. But you wait, and in that line of centers, you communicate to its ground centers in sequence, location, or setting through all line core centers. Inside rotations, travel calculation. Okay, so we point the graphs and mapping lines of 1, the cross lines of indication lines, degrees, north, not north line east, 1 over 7 lines of east, set through degrees over lines of set lines of sequence, ground centers line communication, a solar line spin, and rotational lines, and 144 flux. Process of indication setting and travel. On center, on communication lines of 3 centers of calculations, crop circles of 1, earth over 6, and line communication lines of convergence over travel. On line centers, process lines of 3 indication line condition setting, solar panels, solar direct centers and location setting, over lines of flux, over lines of pi, and set of operation, and set lines of sequence location. 3 centers of calculation lines, ground centers, set lines of communication to its position to its operation. Travel point lines of graph, directing lines of grounds. Okay, so we go to the graph screens, we go through the solar panels. Now that cross the angles and cross line angles location setting to window frames, having direct lines into E factors over decoding location setting of cycle. Sets communication position, 45 angles. Let's go in positions on center, on communication to a system, to webbing system, appearance activation line rotation, a row graph screen location. Inside line condition setting, you work with the inside line, which is the outline rotation of your solar system. That's right. Grid line screens, outside line conditions, inside rotations, and travel calculation. Onlooker, on course centers, on communications, on time. Observing location setting all through travel. Indicate line centers, security line position all levels. Measure and scales, firewalls. Indicate lines of 4 centers of sequence lines of pillars of light. Sets calculation ground center and security lines positions. In 3 lines of centers as center operation lines of sequence. Inside travels, point lines of graph. Done by equation. Okay, so as this is all set up, guys, you have to understand how to modify your system to your memory card and understand the SIM card to its setting of its circuitry line connection to its convergence. Setting on-line sequence, on-line centers in location and setting that tethers the attachment location setting to your memory that processes how to use your set position, your telepathies, how to use the telekinesis in one frame, okay? 1 frame traction, 1 location, 1 calculations, and 1 stream. So the provision lines is a miracle line connection to connect to your handlers, to connect to your anchors. 4 centers of sequence, and set lines of scale, okay? Inside line connection to travel, okay? Then we change the formation lines and settings in position of box frame, location, and window frame. So we have 4 lines of graphs, and set lines of window, line condition to film strip. Inside line conditions, convergence system, all through travel, all through directions. Set recourse in position lines, out signal location to its setting. Black hole. Sets convergence, time loop, time centers, time calculations, time pi. On center, 3 centers of platforms and rotational lines, circuitry line connections, all levels. Change position, see, disappeared. All right, it's supposed to disappear because it never was there until you position your setting. Memory cortex, memory line centers, and sequence lines of grounds. That's where it's supposed to be in rotation. 3 centers of travel, 3 line direct lines of grounds and lines of sequence. Security lines of rotation, 3 centers of 1, operation lines of 2, Fibonacci's of 4, Fibonacci's of 6, over lines of 12, or over lines of sync. On center, on communication, on setting. Circuitry lines, 3 centers of grounds, 4 centers of measure, 5 center lines of pi, line condition setting, position of now, set line course centers, changing the memory cortex of design line, circuitry line conditions, your oculars, your ocpi, line circuitry line connection setting, in position of processing, all the convergent system, all through the constellation lines, a cosmic clismic location of design. All set lines of travel done by equation. So I wanted to show you I can set 3 platforms in that position, how the outline centers to its position of galaxy alignment disappeared in front of you. That's all set in position. All right, as we go through the line centers, we on-link line connections at intervals. Now the interval sets lines of time frame. Now this correlates communicates to its body frame, the track locates to its dream circuit. The dream circuit correlates communicates to its convergence, allocates timeline center. So we allocate time centers, location setting, clock and lines of reference into position of crossing streams. Crossing streams that indicate lines of 2 over tractions That's 7 over scale. Split lines of 7, split lines of 1, and go back to 0, position of 0 lines, 2-point lines of 0, 1. 3 indicate lines of 2 over attractions, 1 line setting, 1 period McAfee stream location. Now, indicates lines of 3 weather patterns, indicate lines of flux over time, capacitor over time. Sets coordinates at communication lines of 0, cross lines of 1 over lines of triangulation over 2. Sets course centers of timeline, triangulation over 1 flux. Set course centers into particle streaming. 4 centers of triangulation lines of flux over line. High centers lines of travel. So we take the 7 lines, 7 sequence, 2 over scale. Sets a webbing line, equal line course centers directing inside line connects to outside barrier, location setting, travel course centers of communication lines of time frame. Sets coordinates of communications positions all through outline center inside rotations to its travel to its pyramid. Sets travel course centers of time frame. So tether, process lines inhibitors over screen adaptators. Console all course centers into timeline. Sets graphs, measure and scale of point line centers in position of console. Travels point line graph, climbing the ladder, and line condition setting and convergence, all through travel, all through coordination. Okay? Inside line condition setting, process lines that indicate overline centers of travel. Outside signals, location system, that sets lines of time frame, and a half pipe lines of 1/6 over measure. Inside line condition setting, sets all communication setting over your mapping system, all through schematics of design. So, inside rotation lines, we have a triangulation over line, cross line condition of angles. Okay, 1 black strip, cross lines of gray over 1. So we signify the line centers in orange sequence. 3 centers of travel into highways over a sequence. Sets line screen adaptation to 1/80,000, which is a green line surface. 2 centers of travel and a mothership over cross location and direction. Setting on centers on communications on pi. Okay, that indicates 1 flux. Now we had a webbing line, 1 rotations, 1 ground, 1 surface. Now we allocate timeline to change the sim cortex to your design line. Set coordinates, longitude, and latitude. Elongate your system in plasma line. High direct lines into configuration setting and securities of panels. Inside line condition setting. A mapping line in rotation outside signal, crossing over lines, and a mapping line connected to its highways and set coordinates. Longitude, latitude over cross location setting. A mapping communicates to its position of its operation outside signals. In communication position to high course centers and travel and the location of its setting of its memory of its cortex of design. Done by equation. All right. That's what it is in set position. It's all set up. So this is your memory cortex connected to your cerebral. Now understand how to open up the window frame. Course centers is the course centers that you have in direct line. Line centers, you have your keys, the correlation of its knowledge, existing, and Y screen. Cross line direct lines on center on communications on pi. Sets reckon time centers, time center on communications on pi generation lines of time frame location to its cycle. All set position lines of travel. There it is, a mapping center. Okay? All through travel, all through calculations. Okay, coordinates over line centers sets all communications to its position to its operation line grounds and online center on communications. Travels calculation screen locations. Inside travel at time frame location. Okay? Okay, so we outlined the signals. We go to a blue line rotation 1 center. Outside signals and line conditions. Over cross angles that sets the perimeters of parameters and the plasmazing moles. Indirect lines and communicates the position of its convergence. Okay, and then we go line course centers, cloak and dagger. We set a graph line, invisible 1 rotations, infrared, direct lines, transparent, translucent, thermal, and X-ray, and radioactive line course centers into radiation. Travel point lines of graph, 3 centers of scale. Sets coordinates and communication lines of flux over 1. We overline course centers, orange line centers. Correlate the communication convergence, line direct line ground centers, on sequence, on communication, on direct line connection setting, and now lines of sequence. Travels point line center. Inside locations, door recognition of time frame. All right, so code weaving, rotation ground centers, and crop circle location setting travel. That's done by equation. So your center ops, your direct lines and line connection setting to your direct link is online, on grid, on pi. The intercircuit location to the outer line spectrum puts all communication system all through travel. Okay, so now we come into the graph line 3 centers, 2 center operation triangulation lines, box frame. Okay? Okay, we travel to that line centers all at once, right? So we indicate on centers, process over center and sequence, inside center operation. Okay? Now you have to understand how to get into correlation of consciousness, understand the three panels of what's going on through travel. Inside line connotes memory cortex as set lines of communication, the high centers of travel. So we go communication setting, go graph screen location, your pyramid, 1/3 over ground, triangulation over cross line angles, flux over 2, flux over 3, flux over 4, and set lines of communication. Pyramid activation 1, coordinates of signal, graph communication, triangulation of flux. Set course centers, timeline centers, and location setting. Pyramid activation 1, console line connection to travel. Laser direct lines, this is where you come into cosmos, this is where you come into your cosmic breath, this is where you come into line positioning elixir, directing ground centers into the sacred flame. Course centers, line connection setting, sets all travels, point lines of 3 centers. Process in position online floater. Inside line connection position with flywheel. Sets all travels, direction timeline. 1/8,000 comes as center operation, directs line links, set lines of box, triangulation. Sets coordinates of triangulation and position lines of box and frame communication. Sets operation lines of sequence and coordination and calculation. 3 grounds of setting, 3 plateaus, locates to its cycle. On center, on communication, all in direction, all right? Now, we change the time lock centers and set course centers of communication, okay? Inside line conditions of triangulation box and rotation lines of grounds. So, record the communication lines of E, process lines of E, process lines of E. So E equals E equals E. 3 centers position, process lines of M, process lines of M, process lines of M. Mine, position, mine alterations, mine configuration of 3/4. Sets lines of travel. Process lines of triangulation lines, coordinate communication and convergence lines, space-time line centers, circuitry lines, box frame. Okay, you got triangulation box, rectangle box over frame, process line connection and convergence system, all through flux and set lines of anomaly. All set lines of travel, directing on center, on communications, on pi. Done by equation, all right? So we set position lines of frame lines, we go through the other side line condition setting to its pyramid and set travel, okay? Setting graph screen locates to its cycle. On center communications, on center, on communication is Stargate, routes the routers again, and travel communication is spectacle, process line, any communication, particle accelerator. Thermal line centers, rotate the line connection setting, convergence of 45 flux line, direct lines of grounds on sequence, on communication, on calculations. Graph line centers and travel. Done by equation. We're all done. We're all done. So you guys are definitely going to need a timeout for that because it's all done through its equation now. Your memory cortex is coming in provision. You calculate the lines of your SIM cords, directing lines of your SIM cards is now in signal, a modification online center on communication setting to your tech support, location of secure.org. Now you're in line save location system, all through tractions and locations. Okay, all done by equation. Okay, all center line is now in sequence. Okay, it's all done. Woo! All right, so that coordinates your longitude and latitudes. Spacing line directing interference location of travels of point lines to set location of systems, all through tractions, all through set design of your construct, your blueprints, and your divine. Okay? See you in 5. Whoop, whoop.